He was demoted to the rank of private, and everyone believed his story had ended. But little did anyone expect that this very soldier would single-handedly cripple an entire enemy base. What began as punishment became one of the most fearless acts of heroism in history. But why was this man so hated that the army had to strip him of his title? This is the story of Private Edward Carter, the man who turned an impossible stand into a defining moment of war. Carter's story was far from a simple tale of battlefield triumph. In fact, his greatest conflicts were not only with enemy soldiers, but with the racism within his own ranks. The U.S. Army, which proudly celebrated black heroes in earlier wars, strangely awarded no medals of honor to any African American in World War II. Regardless of the racism he faced, Carter did not cripple the enemy stronghold with backup, heavy weapons, or orders. He did it alone, wounded and surrounded. Here was a man who fought fascists across continents, only to face open prejudice in the army he served. His life embodied the greatest in bravery, and yet the worst in terms of equality and injustice. But the question on everyone's mind is, how did one man accomplish such a daring feat? Well, his journey began on May 26, 1916 in Los Angeles, California, where he was born. A time when America was deeply divided by race and opportunity. Growing up in the early 20th century, Carter came of age during the Great Depression, an era that shaped a generation through hardship, discipline, and resilience. As a young man, he showed an early interest in the world beyond his neighborhood. Before the United States even entered World War II, Carter traveled abroad, spending time in Europe and reportedly fighting with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade during the Spanish Civil War. That experience exposed him to combat early and forged a sense of duty that would later define his life. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, Carter felt compelled to serve. Despite knowing the realities faced by Black Americans in a segregated military, he enlisted in the U.S. Army that same year. His decision was driven not by promises of equality, but by a belief that fascism had to be stopped, and that service was a responsibility, even to a country that treated him as a second-class citizen. Carter's early life in the Army was marked by contradiction. He proved himself intelligent, capable, and fearless, quickly rising through the ranks during training. Yet his talent was constantly overshadowed by racial prejudice. He enlisted for the U.S. Army, determined to serve a country that still denied him full equality. Like many African-American soldiers, he entered a segregated military where opportunity was limited and expectations were brutally low. Carter was sent to Camp Walters in Texas for training, a place that would test him in ways combat had not yet begun to. Texas in the early 1940s was ruled by Jim Crow, and the uniform did little to protect black soldiers from open hostility. Carter later wrote to his wife describing the conditions as degrading, saying they were treated less like soldiers and more like property. Despite the racism, Carter stood out. He rapidly excelled, earning a promotion to staff sergeant. Yet Army officials blocked his progress at every turn. In one stark order, he was demoted back to private and told that black men don't lead white soldiers. Discrimination outweighed merit in this case. Carter was stripped of his rank simply because of his skin color. He trained harder, learned faster, and proved himself capable under pressure. And that's exactly the reason why he caught the attention of a high-ranking Army official. His fortunes changed when General George S. Patton, a commander with no room for prejudice, gave him a job. Patton made Carter one of his personal guards, and after witnessing Carter's valor in combat, even restored his sergeant's stripes. Then his story took a dramatic turn. On March 23, 1945, near the city of Speyer, Germany, Edward Carter rode forward in a tank assigned to escort advancing American infantry. You have to understand that under the segregationist policies of the era, black soldiers were largely barred from combat roles. relegated instead to supply lines and service units. When the army finally grew desperate for infantry replacements during the push into Germany, they offered a deal that tasted like ash. Black, non-commissioned officers could fight, but only if they voluntarily gave up their rank. The battlefield was already alive with chaos when German anti-tank fire struck. The shell punched through the armor of the tank, sending fragments of metal tearing through the compartment. Shrapnel ripped into Carter's leg, flooding the tank with smoke, fire, and screams. For most soldiers, that wound would have meant evacuation. Carter did the exact opposite. Bleeding and barely able to stand, he climbed out of the damaged tank and stepped into open ground swept by enemy fire. Ahead, an entrenched German stronghold had completely stalled the American advance. Two well-placed machine gun nests dominated the road, cutting down anything that moved and locking friendly troops to the ground. Every second they remained active, more lives were at risk. Carter moved forward anyway. With bullets snapping past him, he advanced alone toward the first emplacement. He raised his rifle and fired with calm precision, cutting down the machine gun crew and silencing the weapon that had terrorized the road moments earlier. Without stopping to tend to his wound, Carter pressed on. He closed the distance to the second nest under direct fire and repeated the assault at point-blank range. Within minutes, both positions were destroyed, and the enemy's carefully built defense began to collapse. But the battle was not finished. As Carter pushed deeper into the position, 8 German soldiers rushed him in a sudden counterattack. Outnumbered, wounded, and isolated, Carter made a split-second decision. He fell among the dead and lay motionless, blending into the carnage. One might call it the classic example of playing dead. The enemy approached cautiously, believing the threat was over. When they were only steps away, Carter sprang to his feet and unleashed his pistol at close range. 6 soldiers fell instantly. The remaining 2 froze and surrendered. That moment broke the stronghold. The defensive line crumbled, the road was cleared, and American forces surged forward to continue the advance. What had been an impenetrable position moments earlier was dismantled by a single wounded private acting on instinct, courage, and refusal to quit. Edward Carter did not just survive that battlefield. He reshaped it, proving that one man's resolve could change the course of an entire fight. And after such a daring act, you would think the U.S. Army would recognize his brave efforts. But his story had taken another painful turn. Sadly, his heroism could not overcome the color barrier. When the smoke cleared and the reports were written, Edward Carter's actions left no room for doubt. Army review boards documented every detail of his stand at Speyer. The charge under fire, the destroyed machine gun nests, the wounded soldier who refused to fall back and instead shattered an entire enemy position alone. On paper, the conclusion was unmistakable. Carter had earned the Medal of Honor. But the recognition never came. Behind closed doors, his heroism was filtered through a different lens. The same institution that praised his bravery quietly downgraded his reward. Not because the act fell short, but because the man who performed it was black. Instead of the nation's highest military honor, Carter was handed the Distinguished Service Cross, a second-tier medal that could not hide the truth it represented. His courage was acknowledged, but only to a limit the system would not cross. The message was clear. Carter returned home carrying medals for wounds and service, bronze stars and Purple Hearts that spoke of sacrifice but not celebration. There were no parades, no headlines, no national recognition of what he had done. His most defining moment remained buried in military files, known only to those who had bothered to read them. Years later, in 1949, Carter tried to return to the army. Once again, he was turned away. His record, now labeled suspect, became a quiet excuse to shut the door. The same institution that had relied on his bravery in war no longer wanted his service in peace. Edward Carter left the army with an honorable discharge, but without justice. He understood why. The uniform could be removed, but the prejudice could not. His resentment was not loud or public. It was carried in silence, alongside the knowledge that he had done everything asked of him and still been denied what he had earned. Time moved on, but justice did not move with it. Edward Carter returned to civilian life without ceremony, carrying memories of a war he had helped win and a recognition he had been denied. He lived quietly, never elevated beyond the rank of sergeant, never publicly celebrated for the moment he changed the course of a battlefield. In 1963, Carter passed away, largely unknown to the nation he had served. He was laid to rest in a modest grave in Los Angeles, his greatest act of heroism still buried in military paperwork rather than history books. Greatest act of heroism still buried in military paperwork rather than history books. Decades later, the country was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. In the 1990s, the Pentagon launched a formal review examining the systematic exclusion of black soldiers from the Medal of Honor during World War II. File after file was reopened. Citations were reread. And when Edward Carter's record surfaced, it was impossible to ignore. The evidence was overwhelming. The courage was undeniable. The omission was no longer defensible. In January 1997, 52 years after the battle near Speyer, President Bill Clinton stood before the nation and posthumously awarded Edward Carter the Medal of Honor. It was handed not to the man who earned it, but to his family, standing in his place. The room was filled with applause, but the moment carried a quiet ache. The honor had finally arrived, but far too late for Carter to ever hear his name called. Edward Carter's victory was acknowledged, but not when it truly mattered. Not when he was alive to feel its weight. And his late recognition stands as a prime example of institutional racism. It has the power to erase heroism, delay justice, and deny individuals the recognition and rights they have clearly earned. Unlike personal prejudice, institutional racism is embedded within systems, policies, and decision-making structures. It operates quietly, often under the appearance of fairness, while consistently disadvantaging people based on race. For many heroes, this meant that acts of extraordinary courage were acknowledged privately but withheld publicly, leaving their sacrifices unrecognized for decades or forever. Despite documented proof that he met every requirement for the Medal of Honor during World War II, the award was denied solely because Carter was black. Military review boards admitted his actions were worthy of the highest honor, yet settled for a lower decoration. The system did not deny his bravery. It denied his right to equal recognition. Carter carried that injustice to his grave, only receiving the honor more than 50 years after his death. But what is truly shocking is that he was not alone. During the same war, Vernon Baker led assaults against heavily fortified German positions in Italy, destroying enemy strongholds and saving countless lives. Like Carter, Baker's valor was undeniable, yet he was denied the Medal of Honor during his lifetime. It was not until 1997 that the award was finally granted, decades after the war had ended. By then, the delay itself had become part of the injustice. Another example is Henry Johnson, a World War I soldier who fought off a German raid alone, despite being wounded more than 20 times. His actions saved his fellow soldier and stopped an enemy advance. France awarded him the Croix de Guerre almost immediately. The United States did not. Johnson died in poverty and obscurity in 1929. He was only posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 2015, nearly a century later. Institutional racism does not always announce itself openly. It hides behind paperwork, review boards, vague justifications, and silence. In each of these cases, the system had the evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and the authority to act. What it lacked was the willingness to treat black soldiers as equals, historical legacy, and national memory. When heroes are denied their rights, history itself becomes distorted, presenting an incomplete and unjust version of the past. These delayed honors do not erase the harm caused. They simply confirm it. They prove that bravery was never the issue. Equality was. Edward Carter and others like him remind us that heroism can exist even when justice does not, and that confronting institutional racism is not about rewriting history, but finally telling it honestly. His story stands as more than a tale of bravery. It is a mirror held up to a nation that allowed prejudice to outweigh valor. 2 wars defined his life. One fought against an enemy overseas, and another fought at home against a system that judged worth by color rather than courage. And that wraps up today's video about Edward Carter's journey. Wasn't he a true American hero? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about Pedro's legacy. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.